name is Michelle Elson. I'm the Vice President of Programs for the Alameda League of Women Voters, and I'm your moderator for this evening. On behalf of the League, we want to welcome you to this evening's very important forum. The League of Women Voters is a nonpartisan political organization. We neither support nor oppose any political party or candidate at any level of government. We organize forums like this one to promote the informed and active participation of citizens in government. So thank you all for being here tonight. Tonight we're going to be talking about sea level rise and what Alameda can do and is doing to prepare for it. Sea levels along the California coast are expected to rise 16 inches by 2050 and 55 inches by 2100, according to a 2009 California State Lands Commission report. Low-lying Alameda could be especially hard hit. FEMA's flood map for Alameda, updated in December, shows that approximately 2,000 island parcels sit inside a 100-year floodplain, putting them at a higher risk for flooding. I'm very excited to introduce the panelists who will be presenting to you tonight. All the way at the end, Dr. Christina Dahl is a senior climate scientist with the Union of Concerned Scientists, and she'll provide an overview of sea level rise and its current impacts. Todd Hallenbeck, who supports the Bay Conservation and Development Commission's Adapting to Rising Tides program, will discuss the risks Alameda faces, the need for collaborative efforts to adapt, and existing local and regional collaborative efforts. Arthur Feinstein, who is a member of the Sierra Club of California's Executive Committee, will offer concrete solutions for addressing sea level rise. And Alameda's Deputy Public Works Director, Aaron Smith, will discuss Alameda's Climate Action Plan and the city's efforts to update it to address these risks. More information about all of our panelists is available on the bio sheet that you got on your way in the front door. Before we get started, I'd like to outline our basic ground rules for tonight's forum, which are as follows. First of all, there will be no video or audio recordings during the event. The League will be recording tonight's forum. Mr. Ed Coover is providing the recording for us, thank you. And that video is going to be made available on our website, lwvalameda.org. Audience members are asked to refrain from shouting out questions or commenting to individual speakers. Has been known to happen just from time to time. And the questions from the audience will be submitted in writing and may be restated by the moderator for clarity. Cards are available to submit a question, and we'll even give you a pen to write it. Ruth Dixon Mueller, who is the League's board secretary, is in the back, and she will be handing out the cards. So if you would like one, raise your hand and she will walk one over to you with a pen. We will do our best to get all of the questions answered in the time we have, but please understand that we may not be able to ask all of the questions presented. Finally, I would like to thank the community of Harbor Bay Isle for donating this forum space tonight, and also I want to thank League member Bill Smith, who did the lion's share of the work pulling together tonight's forum. And with that, we're going to start with Dr. Dahl.
We'll start here. Hi everyone, I'm Christy Dahl. It's really a pleasure to be here for you all. I give a lot of community presentations, but I have to say the League of Women Voters has a special place in my heart. My mom was the president of our local chapter growing up, so I grew up to the sound of her running off dittos in the basement, and I really appreciate the work that you all do. So I'm a climate scientist with the Union of Concerned Scientists. If you're not familiar with UCS, we're a national advocacy organization that aims to do rigorous science to help solve some of the world's most pressing problems. And in our opinion, climate change is one of those pressing problems. For several years now, we've focused our climate change work on sea level rise specifically. So I'll be showing you some of the results that we've generated for Alameda in particular, as well as just talking about the general issue of sea level rise and what we're facing. Next slide, please. So global warming is the primary cause of sea level rise. The way this works is that as we add greenhouse gases like carbon dioxide to our atmosphere, the atmosphere warms up. And in turn, that causes ice that's based on land, like the Greenland ice sheet or the Antarctic ice sheet, to melt. And it also causes the oceans to warm. And so as the ice on land melts, we're adding water to the oceans, which drives the sea level higher. And as the ocean warms, the water expands, and so that also drives sea level higher. Next slide, please. Since the year 1880 or so, we've seen about 8 inches of sea level rise as a global average. And California has been around that global average, whereas places on the East Coast, sea level is actually rising more quickly than the global average. This is something we can observe both with satellite data and tide gauge data. Next slide, please. Okay, good, thank you. In terms of how much sea level rise we'll see in the future, Michelle presented some numbers for California, and here I'm showing a few different projections of how much sea level could rise between now and the year 2100. So you can see there are 4 curves here. There are the colorful ones, the pink, yellow, and green, as well as a light gray one that represents a very extreme scenario. But there's uncertainty about how much sea level will rise in the future because it depends on a couple of factors. It depends on our future greenhouse gas emissions. It also depends on how the Earth responds to those emissions. And we don't know either of those things with incredible precision. So scientists usually present a range of scenarios, and we use those scenarios to evaluate risk in different ways. So if you are building, say, a nuclear power plant right on the coast, that's something that you know you do not want to have flooding. And so you might plan for a very high sea level rise scenario. Whereas if you're putting in a new public park along the water, you might have more tolerance for flooding in the future, and you might be willing to plan for a lower amount of sea level rise. In our work, in the work I'll be showing today, we've looked at the two, the pink and the yellow. The pink higher scenario projects about 6 feet of sea level rise globally by the end of the century. So that's a little bit more than Michelle was talking about in her presentation. And we looked at the yellow scenario, which is an intermediate scenario that projects about 4 or 4.5 feet by the end of the century. Next slide, please. Thank you. The work that we've done on sea level rise in the last few years has focused on what we call chronic flooding or chronic inundation. So what this is the idea that long before something is underwater with every high tide, it's going to be seeing more frequent flooding during above normal high tides. So right now, has anyone heard of king tides? Okay, right. So this is essentially looking at areas that will experience basically that king tide flooding 26 times per year or more. So that works out to, on average, every other week. So we've mapped out the zones throughout the whole coast of the lower 48 that will be experiencing this chronic flooding due to sea level rise with these different scenarios between now and 2100. And then we've combined those zones with real estate data from the company Zillow, an online real estate company, to get a sense of how many homes are at risk of this chronic inundation over time and where the hotspots of risk are. If anyone's curious, this report called Underwater that we wrote that came out last summer, I have copies back in the back, along with a brochure called Know Your Risk that's a guide for potential homeowners who are interested in this issue. Next slide, thank you. So we've created these maps that show the zones of chronic inundation and how they change over time. This is a stretch of the New Jersey coastline, so don't worry if you don't recognize this area. It's just an example. All of these dark blue areas are areas that would be experiencing chronic flooding, so flooding 26 times per year or more, in the year 2035 on the left with the intermediate scenario, and in 2100 on the right. Depending on where you're sitting, it may be difficult to see, but the extent of that chronic flooding grows over time. Next slide. When we look nationwide, we see that in the year 2060, there are about between 270 and 360 communities where chronic inundation would affect 10% or more of the community in that time frame. For Alameda, which you won't see up on those maps, the time frame at which it hits that 10% of the land affected by chronic inundation is closer to the year 2080. So in some senses, Alameda has more time to plan than many East and Gulf Coast communities that we studied. When we look at the extent of chronic inundation in Alameda, so this map should look more familiar, here we're looking at the extent in the year 2035. So you can see part of Bay Farm Island starting to experience that flooding in that dark blue area. If you can click through the next few. This is the year 2060, so you can start to see in the northwest corner of Alameda Island, starting to see some inundation there. And then next is the year 2080. And then finally the year 2100. These are all with the intermediate sea level rise scenario. So we do see parts of the island starting to see this chronic inundation in the 2060 timeframe, but that really starts to become more prominent in the last 40 years or so of the century. Next slide. Oh, I apologize. One of the maps here isn't showing up, but this was intended to be a comparison of looking at the same intermediate map we had just saw and the high scenario map. So you can see that in that high scenario, much more of the island experiences that chronic flooding. There it is. Thank you. Okay, next slide. In terms of what this means for coastal property, you can click through to the next one, please. We see a number of homes starting to experience chronic inundation in Alameda and communities around the Bay Area over time. This is going to be hard to see. That big blue line is San Mateo, and all the way on the farthest left is Alameda. So by the end of the century, with this intermediate scenario, there are about 5,000 homes in Alameda that would be at risk of this chronic flooding. Next slide. Here's how the number of those grows over time. So in the 2035 time frame, which is the earliest we looked, there are about 300 homes that are at risk, and that steps up over time. And you can see that big jump between the green bar and the blue bar is between 2080 and 2100. So you see a lot more homes starting to face that risk in that time frame. The value at risk mirrors the number of homes that are at risk. So we evaluated the total value of the properties based on their current assessed value that is at risk. I'd be happy to get into those details if anyone's curious. And finally, I just wanted to note that when a home starts to experience chronic flooding, it's obviously a direct problem for that homeowner, but that can have repercussions far outside that home. So if your neighborhood, for example, gets the reputation as a neighborhood where homes are starting to flood, that can affect property values in that neighborhood. If property values start to decline, we can see declines in property tax revenue, which can affect the services that are funded by that revenue. So there's really a constellation of different sectors and entities that are affected when a community starts to experience this type of flooding. So I think I will leave it there and pass it along to my fellow panelists.
All right. Thank you so much for that. I'm going to invite Todd Hallen back up so we don't have to strangle anybody with a microphone cord.
Yeah, my name is Todd Hollenbeck. I work with the Bay Conservation Development Commission. I'm a GIS specialist with that agency. And I work with their Adapting Rising Tides program. I'm really excited to be here to talk to you a little bit about what the ART program's been doing, working regionally to support local adaptation. And as a personal note, I live in Alameda, so these are all issues that are very near and dear to my heart as well. If you could advance the slide, please. The Adapting to Rising Tides program, or ART for short, is part of the Bay Conservation Development Commission. We're a state agency that some of you may be familiar with, who are tasked with protecting the Bay and its resources. Our agency is comprised of both a regulatory unit and a long-range planning division. And this Adapting to Rising Tides program is part of our planning unit, which works collaboratively in partnerships around the Bay Area to support provide guidance, resources, and technical support for sea level rise adaptation planning in the San Francisco Bay. Next slide, please. The art program began in 2011 right here in Alameda County, and has done significant work across multiple scales and sectors to identify vulnerabilities to sea level rise and also recommend adaptation strategies. One of our earliest projects was focused here in Alameda and Oakland, called the Alameda Oakland Resilience Study, which examined the vulnerability of Bay Farm Island, the Oakland Airport, the Coliseum areas. As a result of leading and supporting a number of these projects, the ART program has developed a number of resources and toolkits and technical resources that local planning projects can pick up to use to get started doing adaptation planning. Some of these have actually been used in the city's climate action plan that Erin may be talking about. And so you can find all of these resources at our adaptingtorisingtides.org website. Currently, we're engaged in a Bay Area-wide study called Art Bay Area, and this is a look at vulnerability to our region's transportation system, natural areas, growth areas, and vulnerable communities. Hopefully this project will be completed this fall. Next slide, please. To support all that work that I just mentioned, we recently launched the Bay Shoreline Flood Explorer. This is an online tool that helps visualize what could be at risk of flooding from storm surge and sea level rise. It's intended to support regional planning. It's intended to help local jurisdictions and regional agencies identify what areas could be at risk and might warrant further study or adaptation. And generally raise awareness about what could be at risk of flooding without proper planning and adaptation. We think these maps are really well suited to supporting planning in this way. They were ground truthed by local experts. They help communicate both the flooding impacts of storm surge and sea level rise, and they also highlight low points in the shoreline that may lead to inland flooding and maybe areas to prioritize for adaptation. However, just with any models, there are limitations, and in particular with our flood models, they don't include other factors that may contribute to flood risk like groundwater flooding, which is an issue in Alameda and is expected to increase with sea level rise. Next slide, please. One of the recent developments one of the new developments since the start of our project has been the release of the state of California's sea level rise guidance last year. This provides more locally refined projections of sea level rise for California than some of the global estimates. This incorporated best available science from some of those global models and sort of provides a framework for decision making for local agencies and about what to expect and how to start planning for sea level rise. This is information that BCDC uses when they're evaluating shoreline development projects as well. And it can be helpful when using some of these online tools to gain a sense of when we might expect some of these impacts to occur. While the near-term projections are pretty consistent with some of the previous guidance, beyond 2050, as Christina mentioned, sort of the rate and uncertainty of the projections increases. According to the state level guidance at 2100, these projections can range from about 3 feet to over 10 feet, given certain scenarios. So I'm going to show you some of the mapping work that we've completed for Alameda and how they relate to the state guidance. Next slide, please. These are going to be a little bit difficult to see, but these are maps that we produced using the online Flood Explorer. And as I mentioned, one element that our mapping does is try to communicate that there can be flooding temporarily from storm surge as well as long-term flooding from sea level rise. And we need to start planning for both. And so in this map, we're showing 12 inches of sea level rise in these kind of blue shades. This is approximately the 2030 sea level rise projections, or the equivalent of a king tide today. So here we're showing primarily flooding of some of the tidal wetlands in San Leandro Bay and the Crown Beach Bird Sanctuary. Change the slide, please. If you could advance.
Waiting for it?
Yep.
There we go.
Thank you.
Sorry.
In this map, we're showing 24 inches of sea level rise. This is roughly the 2050 state guidance projections in the equivalent, or the equivalent of a 5-year storm surge event today. So here we start to see flooding up near the Main Street Ferry Terminal, restricting access to that terminal and potentially damaging residences out on Alameda Point up there, and potentially also impacting the Bayview, Weir, and Outfall. You could switch the slide. Here we're showing 36 inches. This would be the 2050 projections plus a king tide, or the equivalent of a 50-year storm surge today. Here we obviously now see extensive flooding of Bay Farm Island, including the Oakland Airport, Doolittle Drive. There's also flooding of Bay Farm lagoons and the Veterans Court seawall. On Alameda Island, we see flooding of Posey and Webster tubes, East Shore Drive, and various storm drain facilities, storm drain pump facilities. So this can obviously be some scary stuff, but as I mentioned, the goal of these maps is really to show what could be at risk without adaptation planning. Luckily, a lot of that work is being done. A lot of work is being done on that front, both locally and regionally. If you could advance. So, in addition to the local work that Erin's going to touch on, the ART program is working on a regional assessment of sea level rise and the Bay Area's vulnerability to it. We're looking at vulnerability across 4 major sectors, primarily our transportation network, our vulnerable communities, natural areas, and transit-oriented growth areas in the Bay Area. Part of this process really emphasizes that even though emphasizes that the things that we depend on to live, work, and play also depend on other things. So even if your house or school or job place does not flood directly, the road that you take to work, the park that you play in, or the storm drain system that your community relies on still may be vulnerable. Through this process, we identified areas in the Bay that had high concentrations of these shared vulnerabilities, and it may not be surprising to you, but Alameda was one area that rose high on that list. As we look to complete this work in the fall, we'll be recommending adaptation strategies to address some of these key vulnerabilities. Another component of the ART process is really the core value of coordinating with our local partners. This is really important because things that you do in one part of the Bay for adaptation can have impacts to adjacent communities as well as further away in the Bay. So I'm going to leave with a few high-level kind of initial findings from our artwork thus far in Alameda. These aren't comprehensive, but touch on some of the key planning issues that need to be addressed. As you're all well aware, as an island, the city, Alameda Island lacks a lot of redundancy in its transportation network. So if the tubes or access to the ferry or SR 260 is impacted, there can be implications for commuter movement on and off the island, as well as emergency access for emergency services. A major source of jobs and regionally significant component of our commuter and goods movement is located at the Oakland Airport, and so disruption of that facility will have wide-ranging impacts, not to mention potential contamination to nearby natural areas and human communities. There are a number of important natural areas in the San Leandro Bay and around Alameda that provide beneficial ecosystem services. As sea levels rise, these tidal marshes may not be able to withstand inundation, and we may lose those services if we're not able to augment them or plan for their migration. But there's still some good news. In reviewing, some of our flood mapping and shoreline overtopping data, it's pretty apparent that while there is extensive flooding, it's caused by overtopping in a few key critical areas around the island. And so addressing those specific areas can have wide-ranging benefits to the rest of the community. So I'm gonna end there, but we're generally really pleased to see how the city is basically been able to take some of the art resources and approaches and take some of this work to the next level here in the city. So I'll stop there.
And we'll have Arthur Feinstein up next. Just a reminder, if you've got any questions, go ahead and raise your hand, and one of these awesome ladies will come by with a card and a pen for you to fill that right out.
Hi, everyone. Nice to be here. My name's Arthur Feinstein. I'm chair of the California Conservation Committee for the Sierra Club.
I can just say that we had technical difficulties. This computer didn't recognize the
So you're not going to...
so we can't display them up there. So I'll be circulating these charts, one for each side and an extra one, a bonus start halfway through on one side. So I apologize for our technical difficulty there.
Well, they're just pretty pictures, so not to worry. Just tell you my experience with Alameda. I was the executive director of Golden Gate Audubon for 15 years, and while I was there, we worked with the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service in saving the Least Tern colony as the Naval Air Station was closing, and now it's owned by the VA, but still going to be there for the Least Tern, so that was the good news. And also, back in the 80s, I led a lawsuit against the Port of Oakland to save the Martin Luther King Regional Shoreline Park. And so if you go to the park there, see the fenced-in area, I was involved in that. So I spent a lot of time in San Leandro Bay and in Alameda, not for a couple of years, but I've been here quite a bit. And sea level rise threatens a lot of what I've been working on, so it's sort of sad, because I worked on wetland restoration, and as Todd was saying, as the sea level rises, tidal marshes start to drown. I chaired a task force for the Sierra Club on adaptation to sea level rise over the last year. We came up with a couple of positions, which is, I guess, why I'm talking here today. And we're the Sierra Club, so we care about nature. We had a two-pronged approach. One is we care about nature, and the other one is, well, we're people. So we got to deal with what's happening to us too. So our positions try and address both of those, but in particular with great concern for our aquatic ecosystem. 70 to 80% of our commercial fish species are dependent upon our shallow water habitats. And what's shallow water? So if you look at the bay, right down the center, you have really deep, hundreds of feet. And then as you go towards the shoreline, gradual or steep gradients getting higher and higher. When you're always underwater, we call it subtidal. When you're influenced by tides, it's called intertidal. And when you get higher up, then you get transition zone and then uplifts. So the most productive of our habitats, or aquatic habitats, are the ones that are in the intertidal and transition zone. So you've all seen mud out in the bay at low tide. Well, that's a tidal flat or a mud flat. Cubic yard per cubic yard, that has more bioproductivity than a cubic yard in the tropical forest. People are always comparing things to tropical forests. It's filled with life, little crustaceans, little worms, it's just packed. And what are those? They're food. They're food for fish, they're food for birds, they're food for other bivalves and things. Mudflats are critical if you want to have life in our bay and ocean. As you go higher up, you get to tidal marshes. That's your vegetated area that is still inundated at high tide, but revealed at low tide. And tidal marshes actually feed the mudflat. They're the base of the aquatic food chain to a great degree because their plants grow rapidly. And then they decay. And that decaying material, the detritus, feeds those small organisms in the mudflat and in the tidal marsh. And so you have your food chain moving up. Tidal marsh plants, tidal marsh detritus, little critters in the mud, and then bigger critters, and then fish, and then birds, and then people. That's your food chain going on. All of that is going to be underwater as sea level rises. And what does that mean? It means fewer fish, fewer crustaceans. It's sort of a real significant impact to the world as a whole, and to people in particular, because we still depend a lot on our fisheries for our subsistence and food. So these are some real significant impacts that we're looking at. Then you look at the human component, which is we're going to be underwater. And granted, not so much by 2050, but the projections after 2050, even at 10 feet, people are going beyond that now. So if you go into the next century, we're looking at really scary numbers if we don't control greenhouse gases. But for the Sierra Club's perspective, we figure, people have a hard time figuring out what to do 20 years or 30 years ahead. Trying to figure out 100 years ahead, it's going to pose a real problem. So we've kept our position paper to 2050, and the reason has already been said. People are very confident, scientists, that we're looking at a range of sea level rise 0.8 to 1.6 feet. That's already cooked into where we are. If we took out all the greenhouse gases tomorrow, it would still be going up just because of the warmth in the oceans and other stuff. So we're going to get those scenarios that you've seen at the 2050 level. And so our policies were developed to address that. And to address that for people and for nature, because we don't think that people will exist without an aquatic ecosystem, and being the Sierra Club, we care that we have one. And so we have sort of a triage system of how you adapt to sea level rise. And the first thing is called natural infrastructure. There's a lot of names being thrown out because a lot of this stuff is new. Some examples are restoring tidal marshes. Tidal marshes actually not only form the basis of the food chain, but they help reduce storm surges. The wetland vegetation absorbs the energy. And again, when we're looking at what are the impacts of sea level rise, you may have 6 inches of sea level rise. You can have another 6 inches of storm surge during a storm, and that's where you get a lot of your flooding. If you have tidal wetlands and a good band of it, then maybe you only get 3 inches of storm surge, and you've reduced the impact a lot. So restoring tidal marshes around the bay, in the South Bay, for example, where you have Google and all of those folks, Facebook, etc., they're restoring hopefully 30,000 acres of tidal marsh, which are going to act as a buffer between sea level rise and those communities, which some of them, like Alviso, have already subsided 10 feet below the bay. So if you imagine another 5 feet at Alviso and you have a storm, you're looking at disaster. So lots of tidal marsh restoration. We can do some here too. Living shorelines. The San Francisco Estuary Institute with San Francisco's Spur have created a adaptation atlas for how to address sea level rise around the bay. And one of their features for natural solutions is beaches. San Francisco Bay used to have 35 miles or more of natural beaches. We have now almost none. But beaches too, if they're long enough and deep enough with their sandy soils or rocky soils, help stop storm surges and reduce storm surges. So they act as another tool for us to reduce sea level rise, and they propose quite a bit of that around the shoreline of Alameda in their atlas. So you might want to look on that, it's online. So those are what we can do now, especially before 2050, when we're not looking at a really huge increase in sea level rise. We can use these natural tools, but we have to start now. It takes time to create beaches, it takes time to create wetlands. Once you get past that, what we hope happens in a lot of instances is called managed or planned retreat. I think that was mentioned before, which is recognizing that some places are just going to be underwater, and especially past 2050. And we should start thinking now about perhaps not keeping those places. And there are communities around, especially on the East Coast, that are already talking about buying out communities and buying out houses where you know it's going to be underwater, and there's an opportunity to restore these natural systems like tidal marshes and beaches, which will help more inland communities resist sea level rise, but also keep our aquatic ecosystem functioning. And so that's a really difficult one. There's a community down in Southern California called Imperial Beach that's already suffering from sea level rise, and their city council said, well, you know, we might want to think, because it's all at sea level, it's all threatened with inundation, we might have to think about managed retreat, and there was over our dead bodies kind of response. This is really sensitive stuff. When you own a house, close to the shoreline too, you know, it's tough. But it's something we need to be thinking about, because if it rises as much as is actually projected nowadays, it's going to be unavoidable no matter what we do, that there's going to be significant flooding in a lot of places. Some communities are thinking of, well, let's raise all our structures 11 feet. That would be raising all of Alameda. That would be a challenge, because because what do you do when you're living here and then they say, well, you have to go up 11 feet, you know, do you build another story? And then if so, where's the road and how do you get around? And as the water comes in, do you go by boats? So you get, we're facing real conundrums of how do we move forward, and the Sierra Club does not have the answers. But in the next 30 years, we do suggest certain things that you do and which communities are ignoring already, which is don't build where it's going to flood. That's a real simple one. So here we have the open A's coming in right on Jack London Square. We have the Warriors in San Francisco, close to my house, that's right on the water. All of those are going to be facing inundation or have to be raised, and if they're raised, then how do you get there if the rest of the access is low, etc. These are difficult questions, but if you don't build in the first place, at least you don't have to face that issue down the road, and who's going to pay for all that infrastructure to be able to get to the Warriors Stadium. So that's one of our big ones, is just don't do it. Use your head, look at the maps, and say, no, let's not. We don't have to talk about leaving right now, but at least let's not put ourselves in the path of disaster. And I think I've probably gone pretty far. We have a bunch more policies, but I think that's the main ones of, you know, let's keep our natural resources, don't build in stupid places, and hope for the best.
Thank you so much. Last call for questions, and our final speaker, Erin Smith.
I'm Erin Smith. I'm the Deputy Public Works Director here for the city. Thank you for having me here tonight. Excited to connect with you guys. I do have a presentation, Bill.
You do, okay. Todd, can you?
Yeah, it's on the desktop there. Do you want me to do that?
Yeah, if you know where it is.
I'll maybe take advantage while you guys, and I'm going to talk a little bit as it goes. So many of you know, and if you don't know, you'll know now, but the city has been working over the last year to develop a climate action and resiliency plan. And I had a slide, but perhaps the visual is not necessary for this first piece. I wanted to go over a little bit about how we developed this plan. City Council about 1.5 years ago gave a high priority referral to update the city's 2008 local action plan for climate protection. It's a mouthful. That plan looked at reducing greenhouse gas emissions and set a goal for 2020 of reducing greenhouse gas emissions 25% below those in 2005. So fast forward, here we are. Council said it's time, we need to update that plan. We worked with the community to scope what this update process would look like. And the Climate Action and Resiliency Plan is approaching it with an integrated approach. We're combining greenhouse gas reduction as well as adaptation.
We've got the slides up.
Okay, great. Maybe if you click forward one. Great. So that first blue box on the left is kind of council's referral, and just for the sake of time, because we just heard a lot of scary stuff from the other speakers, I do want to get into some of the content of this plan that might make us at least be able to sleep tonight. So the boxes along the top were kind of major milestones with a consultant that technical consultant that we're working with named ERG. And the intent of this picture is really just to demonstrate that we structured this process around significant community input. The boxes on the bottom represent 3 community input sessions that we've had already. The other 2 smaller boxes on the bottom represent 2 things, one being a task force. We convened a group of 15 representatives of local interest and business groups, and we did that not only to make sure we were hearing from various perspectives in the community, but we really wanted to use that group to help get the word out about this plan and encourage as much participation as possible. The other group is what we called the Green Working Group, and that was an interdepartmental group. Climate adaptation, it's all departments are involved, from planning and building and public works and emergency response, and so it was critical that we were collaborating amongst the departments. And we also hosted outside utilities, East Bay Mud, PG&E, as well as neighboring agencies, the port, to ensure that, one, they knew what we were doing, and 2, that our efforts were coordinated. Do you mind clicking forward? So we're at the point of the draft plan, and the timing of tonight is the public comment closes tomorrow, and hopefully most of you have known that the plan's been out since May 14th. It is online. Comments are due at the end of business day tomorrow. Perhaps if any of you are new, can certainly hop online tomorrow.
Can you clarify when the online comments close? Because it says there's no date on the page.
May 31st, so the end of the day tomorrow.
Online too?
Yes.
That doesn't say that on your website.
Yeah, we only have one means of really we're intending to collect comments from the public is through that online platform. It's a lengthy document. It's over 100 pages because there's a lot to say. And the online platform allows you to submit annotations line by line for us to hear what you need to say. So this image here is, the plan is taking what we call a climate safe path. And what we mean by that is we're taking action for Alameda to specifically and directly reduce greenhouse gases. We're also hoping that catalyzes change on the global scale. And that red line on this trajectory, this is time on the bottom for those that can't see, that's going out to 2100 towards me. The vertical axis is degrees of warming in the climate. The red line is representing global greenhouse gas emissions as though they stayed on their current course. So no active, significant greenhouse gas reduction. The blue line is intended to represent significant reduction. And as some of the other speakers mentioned, the greenhouse gas pathway is directly related to the amount of warming, which is directly related to the amount of sea level rise we're going to see. Climate change comes with other risks. There's heat and drought and more intense and frequent storms, and all of those, the severity of each of those are impacted by that warming. And so our plan is intended to take action on reducing our own greenhouse gas emissions, catalyzing change on that global scale in the hopes that we get on that blue line. But to be safe, we're planning as though we're on that red line. And we build in an adaptive management approach that says, great, in 20 years, we're on the blue line. We don't need to construct these strategies as robust as they were. We have monitoring and an adaptive pathway to be able to do that. So we hope we're covering all bases is really the intent of our climate safe path. Next slide, please. I'm going to talk briefly, just for sake of time, about the greenhouse gas, because I know we're anxious to get to the strategies on the sea level rise. However, people often ask, what can we do? Well, we can reduce our greenhouse gas emissions today. So this pie chart represents our emissions at 2020. So we did an inventory in order to be able to assess, did we meet that 25% reduction goal that we set in 2008? And the answer is almost. We made it 23%, and this picture here is representing 2020, so about where we're at today. And it's here where our climate action plan picks up in terms of looking forward. And we set let me just first talk about the pie chart, then I'll talk about some goals. So the orange or yellow is our transportation sector. That represents 70% of our emissions is from the transportation sector. The blue is energy use in our buildings, and it's worthwhile to note that that section is greatly benefiting from Alameda Municipal Power's zero carbon power. So that slice of the pie is really representing natural gas use in our buildings. So we look at 2020, we look forward 20 years to 2030, and we've set the plan presents a goal of 50% reduction from 2005. So that in essence would be an additional 27% reduction. It's an ambitious goal. It's more than what the state legislation is currently aiming for at 40%. Next slide, please. This slide is going to help us understand how we're going to get there. The light blue bar on the left would be if we did nothing today and a business as usual went forward to 2030. Population would grow, jobs would grow, emissions would increase. But at the state level, things would happen. Fuel efficiency standards would get better. So Alameda could not be proactive, and our emissions in 2030 would look like that. However, our goal is to be the dark blue one on the left. That would be 50% below our 2005 level. So that's where we need to be. I think that's gray. The first big gray bar represents actions the city's already committed to, and the city's been a leader, and that demonstrates it. And those are really three things: is AMP's continued delivery of zero carbon power, implementing the specifics of our transportation choices plan. Do you mind just for a moment going to the next slide? I'm not sure you'll be able to read this, but these are actions in our transportation choices plan that's really geared at reducing what you might hear the term VMTs or vehicle miles traveled. It's about getting people out of their cars and either taking public transit, walking, biking. So it's called mode shift. And the transportation choices plan is already an aggressive plan. So you mind going back just to the other one? We need to implement that. We also need to implement our zero waste implementation plan. That means we're going to divert 95% of material that going to the landfill. So again, an ambitious goal. But that doesn't get us to our 50%, even when we do those plans. So the climate action plan proposes additional actions in order to get to that. Jump 2 slides. They're in 2 categories. More transportation in our buildings, since that's where our emissions come from. On the transportation side, we address 2 things: deeper cuts in our vehicle miles traveled, beyond that what the transportation choices plan is doing. And then, if you're gonna drive, how do we get more EVs on the road? So those are the 2 main categories. And for the sake of time, I'm gonna jump over the specifics of the action. If you want me to come back, we definitely can, but if you don't mind going forward. So go again, I'll talk about buildings. Is that buildings? Yeah. So in our buildings, it's really how do we get off natural gas? And the plan is pretty radical in one sense, and it's getting a little bit of press right now, in that all new developments will be electric. That's pretty profound. No other city in the area is doing that. The other area is how do we get our existing buildings off natural gas, and we're terming that fuel switching. So for those in the audience that want to take their part, we're looking at how do you swapping out your dryers or your water heaters from gas to electric, because AMP's power is clean carbon. So the actions here are really intended to reduce natural gas use. Next. So I'm going to switch gears a little bit to the adaptation side of things, and we'll keep our fingers crossed that those global greenhouse gas emissions go down, and we're all doing our part to get there. For the adaptation side, I'm not sure that whole slide is showing, but that's okay, I can talk through it. We looked at existing and future conditions. So, and the hazards, can you guys read those hazards? So it's sea level rise, heat, drought, inland flooding from more intense and frequent storms, wildfires. But really how it impacts Alameda is the poor air quality, as we all experienced less than a year ago. That's expected to occur more frequently. So we note wildfires in here because of the air quality impacts. And did I mention extreme heat? Extreme heat. Earthquakes aren't necessarily directly related to climate change. However, given that we are in a liquefaction zone, the rising groundwaters that Todd mentioned can impact the consequence of those earthquakes. So we looked at existing and future conditions, and then we did what was called a vulnerability assessment. And much of what you saw the other speakers is we kind of layer things on maps to say, wow, well, if this rises that much, what's impacted? And we looked at both the built environment and the community. We did what was called a social vulnerability analysis. Climate change will impact all of us, but some of us will feel that burden a little bit more, and that's due to some pre-existing social conditions, income, age, health, transit dependent, and so we really needed to better understand where those communities were in Alameda and ensure that we were addressing them in terms of understanding the vulnerabilities and make sure that our strategies address those communities as well. The plan is part of the social vulnerability assessment is part of the plan. We are hopeful that that will continue to inform outreach and education as well as implementation. So it's an important part of the plan. And then based upon that analysis, we developed strategies, and we did that in a couple of different areas. We did general kind of how to build resilience by sector, meaning in general, what can you do for a building and what can you do for roads? But since sea level rise is so pressing, we did drill into 11 what we call high priority or location specific areas that will be impacted by flooding. And that's both inland flooding from the storms as well as shoreline overtopping. Next. This map gives an overview, and I think Todd hit on some of these areas. The 11 priority locations, one of them I'm going to talk about now that you absolutely have in your power to make change. There's a survey going out right now to raise our storm rate structure. One thing that we have storm facilities that make sure that the water coming from the sky is taken off the road and it's pumped out into the bay. We have deficiencies in that storm system now, and the storms are intended to only get more severe and frequent, so ensuring that we can properly convey that stormwater off the roads is essential. So we note the storm system in general as high priority. The fund has been underfunded for a number of years, so we're going through a rate restructuring as we speak, and we're hopeful that when that money comes in, we'll be able to ensure the appropriate capacity in our storm system. We also, I just wanted to make note, the pink hatched areas, the city's done a lot of work already in regards to adaptation planning, and we didn't need to redo that. We are incorporating that, and I'll give an example is Alameda Point. It has a master infrastructure plan that was adopted in 2014 that addresses sea level rise. So there's perimeter levees and there's adaptive landscapes, and so we didn't feel the need to redo that. As part of this plan, we incorporate that in. So I'm not going to talk specifically about that tonight. I'm happy to answer questions, but it's not part of my slides. Do you mind going forward? And you can cut me off on time if I'm taking too much time. One first area that is actually impacted by the newly issued FEMA flood insurance rate maps is what we call the East Shore area. The dark blue is 36 inches of sea level rise. As we heard earlier, that's a scenario that could happen in 2060. It also represents a 50-year storm today. So next winter we could have this condition temporarily. Just not as a threat, I'm just saying. So how we approached this plan was we wanted to look at what was impacted soonest and with greatest consequence. And that 36 inches of sea level rise threshold was pronounced for Alameda. And so we are looking at the 36 inches of sea level rise areas and allowing time for those further looking 2,100 more extreme scenarios to play out before we are developing strategies for those areas. So in East Shore, I think, Arthur, you talked about mudflats. This is an area of mudflats. There's also some riprap and some seawall that provides current flood protection. At a 100-year storm, they're in the floodplain. And so we look at areas here of enhancing those mudflats through additional material. And I'm sorry, I'm fumbling through my papers here because I wanted to talk about some of the other things that we suggest for this area. So give me a second. There is, for those of you that are aware of the public park pathways that are in that area, there's some work going on there now, so we certainly recommend coordinating on what is being done there. Also looking to build higher barriers. Right now there's walls and riprap, is how do we elevate that? I mentioned mudflat augmentation, and for the more long-term or progressive look, for those of you that are familiar with the resilient by design process that happened, they look at tidal neighborhoods, so that's actually floating homes. Just want to put that one out there. Next slide. So the Bayview Weir, which is part of our storm system, and Todd mentioned it earlier, it's a critical facility right now. It's in the South Shore Lagoon system. Stormwater flows from essentially central down into the South Shore Lagoon, and then it needs to get out to the bay. The Bayview Weir does that. And looking at sea level rise, we're going to have to turn that into a pumping facility. That's really what the strategy is, because waters are going to rise. It'll no longer flow out by gravity. So that whole structure will have to be looked at. We'll have to turn that into a pumping facility. The area is also looking at what we call the Bay Farm Island touchdown. This impacts the Towata Park area. Significant impact at 36 inches. The Ravens Cove Homeowners Association is impacted. This area provides nice opportunity because there's space. There is Towata Park of looking at, as Arthur talked about, maybe a beach area or one of the living shorelines, because there's space to do it. It doesn't need to just be a hardened wall. And that's what I'm going to say about that one. Next slide. Crown Beach is an interesting one. So we own the land. East Bay Regional Park District is the operating entity out at Crown Beach. I'm not sure if many of you know that that sand is not naturally occurring there. It needs to be replenished and redistributed every year. So that is a process that will need to be looked at and assessed as erosion gets more severe with sea level rise. So we are definitely looking to coordinate with East Bay Regional Park District on this one. They're doing a master planning effort. Some of the initial things to look at is how do we stabilize the dune? Maybe that's more vegetation on the beach. Other things to look at out on the water side would be oyster reefs or submerged aquatic vegetation, again, to help control that erosion of the beach. I think that's what I'll say about that one. Next one. The Webster Posey tubes, so there's two things at risk here. This also is impacted by the current FEMA flood insurance rate maps. There is a low spot on the sea wall, on the northern sea wall, that if overtopped, the area behind the tubes would be impacted, as well as water could move over land and then go into the tubes. The tubes are also impacted by the more inland flooding, so more frequent and intense storms. So we certainly make recommendations for Caltrans jurisdiction, it's not the cities, to ensure in the near term that their pumping facilities in the tube are saltwater resistant, and just the practical stuff of getting water out of the tube if it gets in there. The other is extending what we call the flood walls. So again, if water is overtopped from the shore, it doesn't go into the tube. Longer term is going to be fixing that the North Shore wall by raising it. That's a hardened structure now, and it'll just need to be, not just because it's a big effort, but that would need to be elevated. Next slide. I took advantage of one slide. I'm going to talk about three areas, and that's in Bay Farm, and the three areas are Doolitte Drive, Veterans Court, and the Bay Farm Lagoon system, where it discharges to the San Leandro Channel, is the third. And I'll start with the lagoon one. So where that lagoon is discharged into the bay, there's a pumping facility on the trail. Many of you are probably familiar with that. That's a low point, also impacted by the current FEMA flood maps. The homes behind it are. So that structure, that area, it's about a 10-foot section of area, needs to be elevated. And it needs to be done so in a way that's FEMA certified in order to get the homes behind that out of the floodplain. Veterans Court is an interesting one, the one that actually allows, there's an action that could take place if budget allows for it in the coming years. Veterans Court, the actual road, So those that are familiar with the wall, that at King Tide, when you go out there, it's literally brimming. So the structural integrity of the wall is unknown, and it's low. So in the immediate, what we would be doing is raising Veterans Court, the road itself, kind of, it's like we call it the bump in the road to be funny, but it's really a big earthen berm that if that wall was to either fail or overtop, that flooding would be contained bayside from that, essentially where the cul-de-sac is right now. And we're looking to do that. We've gotten some seed money for design and are looking for grant dollars. So that would be an area that in the near term and then further looking is having that either one, building that wall higher or restoring that area to wetland, reducing erosion, and we could call that area managed retreat. That cul-de-sac area, we could just let that go to the bay. None of that's decided, it's just contemplated for consideration in the plan. The Doolittle, did I skip over one? Yeah, no, Doolittle, so there's Doolittle that's in Alameda's jurisdiction, and then there's Doolittle that's outside Alameda's jurisdiction. And this is an area of the original art program that Todd talked about. We are very invested in that project moving forward to implementation. And in short, Doolittle acts as the flood protection for a lot of Bay Farm. And the one area at the Harbor Bay Parkway intersection where the model airplane, that is an area in the near term, we could regrade that area to help with some immediate impacts to flooding, but the long-term solution is regional and needs Caltrans and the port, et cetera, to look at how we elevate, move, have a multi-benefit project in that area that provides flood protection to the island. Next slide. We talked about transit dependence and roads, and roads being flooded means you can't access, might not be able to get out of your home, emergency services can't get there. So we looked at things just generally to do in our high-use roadways, and they're intended really just to get stormwater off the road. So make sure our culverts are draining properly, green infrastructure. For those that are reliant or take public transit, ensure that we have proper bus shelters that are flood-proof. And then looking forward, and a lot of the plans really get at a lot of the same things, which is more ferry service and taxis across the estuaries. Again, getting people out of their car reduces greenhouse gas. It also puts pressure to have enhanced bus or public transit, and that's a good thing because that provides redundancy. Next slide. So the plan wanted to really give some figures to our decision makers about how do they go about making economic decisions around climate change. These are big projects, these are big ideas. How do we begin to even think about funding this stuff? And so we wanted to provide some starting information, and we looked at, similar to what was talked about earlier about number of properties in the floodplain, we used a model that looked at property value, assessed property value from the county, as well as building value and infrastructure value, so the built environment. A full disclosure that this analysis did not look at loss of non-market value and ecosystem services. We just didn't have the money to do that. But if we sum totaled the loss of property, the built environment, as compared to a very conservative estimate of building these protective measures, in every scenario, $1 invested in adaptation saves or avoids at least 3.5 in property loss. So we thought that was a telling story for elected officials if they are in any way unsure about, it doesn't make financial sense to start action now, and we believe our report is saying it does. Next slide. I will touch on this lightly. So the plan doesn't want to just be a plan, it really wants to set itself up for successful implementation, and the first step to do that is the city needs to really hire more staff. One being a sustainability dedicated person to implement this plan that sits in the city manager's office. So that's a clear recommendation that we think is essential for success. We also underline the importance of regional governance. Alameda is not going to solve this alone, and we shouldn't solve this in a vacuum. So really joining, and if not leading, regional governance structures that are looking at climate change. Continued stakeholder engagement is essential, and we put together a timeline in the plan just to gain traction in these initial years, because again, we're invested in success. We're essentially presenting the plan at our various boards and commissions. Have public comment periods been open since middle of the month. It closes tomorrow. We will be taking the plan to council mid-July, and then if need be to come back in September. And with that, I'll end my presentation.
All right, don't go away just yet. We're going to move on to questions.
I can sit though, right?
Sure. Thanks to everybody for coming out and speaking. We really appreciate it. Now it's time for questions. And because we have a very short cord on this microphone, I thought it would be a good idea to kind of do it in a row so you each could come up if need be. And I thought I would have Erin answer questions first, since she was already up here. So I'm going to start with a technical question. What is overtopping?
Sure. Overtopping is when the water is higher than the shore and it comes up and overtops the shoreline structure, whether that's a hardened structure or a beach. It's the idea that the water is higher than that level. Did I get that right? I'm not, for a technical answer, I would definitely look to Todd, but that's my understanding of it.
All right, next question for you. I'm going to do all your questions,
Sure.
so you don't have
Got
to
it.
keep getting up and down. I'll let you know. Second question, when will the city's groundwater study be completed?
So we are actively working on developing a groundwater model, because groundwater in the face of climate change is essential. I don't want to commit to a firm date, but we are actively developing the model. I'd say no more than 3 months we have the model developed, and then some strategies suggested around that to adapt and protect ourselves from rising groundwater.
Okay, and last question for you, since you answered half of the questions folks gave us for you in your presentation. Thank you. Where is the funding coming from to make hard seawall improvements around Alameda? What contribution do we make? If the costs were prohibitive, would Bay Farm Island be abandoned?
First answer, that no. So right now there's not a defined source for shoreline. So we have our storm structure, rate structure, that's underfunded at best, but it's predominantly focused on pipes and pumps. The draft plan suggests options. One being there's an infrastructure bond that could come that, yes, all of you would contribute to. There's also a lot of evolving financing structures in climate change, enhanced infrastructure districts. Maybe it's something that we're joining forces with other entities that have utilities. East Bay Mud is invested, PG&E is invested, but that there be an enhanced infrastructure district where money can come from beyond just Alameda. That's my best answer I have right now, but I'm sure that we've also, the plan suggests what we call a climate fund, and that would be in years of surplus budget, put those dollars into a climate fund that could be used for plan implementation. I think the kind of dollars that are needed for the shoreline may be above and beyond that. Again, the plan suggests a few options, but right now there's not a dedicated source for that.
All right, and that covers your questions. Thank you so much. Arthur, we've got one for you if you'd like to come up, and I think Erin touched on this a little bit, but I would love to hear your answer on this one. Get your perspective on what should we do to preserve the Elsie Romer Bird Sanctuary. What's a best practice?
Well, that's a tough one. For those of you know where the sanctuary is, right at the end of Crown Beach, used to be this wonderful tidal marsh with cordgrass, which is a very special vegetation in the bay. Unfortunately, we got an alien cordgrass introduced into San Francisco Bay, and it was starting to eliminate our native cordgrass, and it grew differently and was threatening some of the habitats. It grew out into the mudflats, so it started reducing mudflats, started reducing a lot of habitat. And so a process was started to eradicate this alien exotic vegetation. And over the last 10 years, the Coastal Conservancy has been leading the effort to do that, and Elsie Romer had mostly this invasive Spartina. So I haven't been in Alameda for 4 years, and I went and looked at it, and there was poor Elsie Romer with no cordgrass. Could cry over it. They supposed to have replanted it. I just talked to an Alameda resident who's involved in it, and they didn't take. So we're hoping that they'll do replanting, and cordgrass is pretty good stuff. I mean, usually comes back. So, but I think they're still spraying herbicides. It's sort of a very controversial process. So anyway, hopefully they'll replant, it'll come back, and it once more will be this thriving tidal marsh, which will be helping save those homes from storm surges, because they're just across the street there, and also provide a home for the California clapper rail, which is an endangered bird. You saw the pictures going around. There was a clapper rail in there. It's now called the Ridgeway's rail. Only found in San Francisco Bay. There's only 1,800 in the world now, or less. The numbers go up and down. And Elsie Romer had a bunch of them, so let's hope it comes back. And if you want to, you can write letters to Coastal Conservancy and say how important it is to reseed and replant Spartina at Elsie Romer.
Just wanted to add one quick thing. In addition to the restoration of the site, our climate action plan, again, these are suggested options in the plan, but we note to study opportunities for the salt marsh to migrate with sea level rise, consider rezoning properties as they become available.
Can I just, communities are just starting to develop these CARPs, climate action plans, and I saw this in Alameda's, and I wanted to say thank you for, we would like to see a lot more of it, but it's a great start, so thank you.
All right, Todd, you're up. We got a big list of questions for you. By the way, while you're coming up, one of the questions was where folks can find these presentations. Can we get copies of them to post on the League's website? Would that be okay?
It's fine.
Fantastic. We'd love to have those up for folks to see. They were great, and we want more people to see those. So, first question, can you describe how the Bay Area is planning to address this problem in a cohesive way? How will funds be raised to finance the adaptations needed?
That is a large question. One of the ways and mechanisms that the Bay Area has to deal with sort of...
Use the mic, please.
One of the ways that the Bay Area has to deal with some of their transportation and community investment is through what is called Plan Bay Area, and it's essentially a plan for long-term growth in the Bay Area. And so for the first time really in this next iteration that they're going to be releasing, they will also be incorporating sea level rise adaptation strategies into some of the investment strategies that they will be looking for federal, basically transportation dollars to help fund. Those are really focused on large, regionally critical, largely transportation projects, but it is a potential source of funds and one mechanism where this is being incorporated. I think regionally it's not adequate, and that there are the beginning to look for whether or not other governance strategies at the regional scale and financial mechanisms are going to really be the catalyst for driving adaptation beyond just sort of some of the major transportation vulnerabilities. But yeah, there's currently, and the BCDC is trying to help explore some of those opportunities with the Metropolitan Transportation Commission, with a lot of our local partners, to see what makes the most sense for the Bay Area. But it's definitely an area that needs to potentially see some radical change in the governance and funding availability. Were there?
I have a
sorry.
whole list here. Thanks.
Not so fast. Jumping off of that, one of the questions we have is, what is the Oakland Airport doing to protect the airport?
The airport, the airport's run by the Port of Oakland, and they've taken information that we've generated through the ARC process. They're currently working on assessments of some of their levee systems to explore both seismic and flood risk, and are, I think, looking to make some investments along those lines. Some of the projects that will ultimately solve some of the primary sources of flooding, again, are sort of tied into some of the things that Aaron mentioned along Doolitte Drive and sort of a regional coordination. So I think they are actively engaged in that process as well, and looking at that coordination with Caltrans and the city and East Bay Regional Parks along Doolitte Drive to see what either long-term solutions can be made there or internal berms can be placed to prevent some of the extensive flooding that you've seen there. So they're working on it.
All right, next question is, could you please comment further on how the sea level rise affects the groundwater level? Groundwater already is an issue for many Alameda basements, and I imagine that will quickly become a more challenging issue with sea level rise.
I will try. I believe the simple answer to that is that as sea levels rise, they are going to exert pressure on the water table, which will essentially drive that groundwater further up to low points on the land. And so where there's already emergence of groundwater, that flooding will be exacerbated, and in places where there may not currently be groundwater flooding, we may start to see that as seas rise. I don't know if
Yeah, I can add a little bit.
Yes.
So I mentioned before Alameda is doing a specific groundwater model. I believe researchers from UC Berkeley did a regional groundwater model, so it's fairly extrapolated, not based on local data. And they are looking at really a couple concerns. There are basements. People experience that now, and that's the pressure from the groundwater on the basement, and if you have the slightest bit of crack in your basement wall, you're going to have flooding. So one of the strategies, and this is not the end-all answer, but is to how you reduce that pressure on your basement is you have like a French drain essentially around your basement so that the water has a place to go that's not inside the wall. So we're going to be developing some resources and some tools on how property owners can kind of rehab methods, if you will, for basements. And I can guess a little bit at what some of the larger strategies are going to be is how do we get the groundwater to go somewhere? And so like in Italy, I understand that they put these big culverts, for lack of a better word, but that are actually collecting and getting the groundwater away from where you need it. There's also pumping that can be done on the levees. So we're going to be putting forth both the model and some suggested strategies around that. I think the area that is very concerning is areas that we would have emergent groundwater. That's under certain sea level rise projections, the groundwater would pond above the surface. And hence, we wanted, right now, the regional model looks pretty scary for Alameda, and we wanted to ground truth that with local data. Is that real? So more information coming.
Okay, last question from your slides. What is the frequency of the floods? This must have been something you talked about in your slides.
When we talk about storm surge, you may be familiar with sort of the kind of FEMA context of these 100-year storm events. And so And we often talk about these various categories of storms or severity of storms in their 1, 5, 10, 20, 100-year storms. What this largely is referring to is the probability that you will see a storm of that size in any given year. And so the 100-year storm is also called the 1% storm surge, and that means that there would be 1% chance any given year that you would see a storm surge of that size. On the, I guess, more frequent or less severe spectrum, you have a 1-year storm surge. This is essentially a percentage that you will see this storm every year. And that's why it's reflected in those 12-inch equivalents to like king tides and things like that. So I guess that's a little bit of what we mean when we talk about the frequency of those storm surge, the frequency of storm surge, if that's kind of what you're referring to. Sometimes it can be confusing terminology, so.
All right, thank you so much. Christy, you're up. We've got your questions. Gosh. So the first question, NOAA estimates a 0.7 degrees Celsius increase in temperature by 2050. This was a result in a 4-foot rise in sea level. What will be the impact on the Navy base? I don't know, I think we kind of talked about that, and I don't know if you want to get into that a little bit more.
Yeah, so we haven't studied the naval base specifically in Alameda, but some of the maps that I showed in my presentation do show that the base would be one of the earlier affected areas of the island. If anyone's interested, I can direct you to an interactive map tool that we've created, similar to the one that Todd talked about, that lets you look at the areas that would be experiencing this chronic flooding in different time periods. So you'd be able to zoom into the Navy base and see what that would look like.
Do you mind if I jump in on that one?
Sure.
So the Alameda Point, or the old naval base, is actively undergoing development, as many of you know and can see. And so there's concerted effort out there to, when the development Site A, which is what's going in right now, they're elevating the ground above and planning for sea level rise. So every action that's happening out there, it actually is I'm not going to say easier, but when there's development happening, these stuff actually can be integrated. It's areas where properties aren't changing and construction's not happening that these things are a lot harder. But the Alameda Point Master Infrastructure Plan calls for a perimeter levee that does plan for end of century that will protect the adaptive reuse area. And then what's called the Northwest Territories, that's the area that's way out there where the least turn habitat is. There's East Bay Regional Park District will be out there, wetland mitigation areas going on out there. The Climate Action Plan actually suggests in that area of the least turn is a very large wildlife refuge, that there may be opportunities for multi-benefit out there and enhancing that habitat from the concrete that it is right now. So Alameda Point has a plan. If any of you are interested in getting more information on that, I would have you search the Alameda Point Master Infrastructure Plan, as well as, for many of you who've heard of D-Pave Park, that's also Alameda Point. That's part of a town center plan where they look at, in the old Seaplane Lagoon, restoring wetlands in that area.
Okay, next question for Christy. What's the best thing we can do to help counter sea level rise and global warming? And there's a question about how about drawdown techniques, and maybe you can explain that a little bit.
Sure, so drawdown techniques would refer to strategies that would actually be taking carbon dioxide and other greenhouse gases out of the atmosphere. So sometimes you'll hear the term carbon dioxide removal, or I'm trying to think of some of the other acronyms.
Sequestration.
Carbon sequestration, exactly. So there are different strategies that are being proposed to start sucking carbon dioxide out of the atmosphere. And right now, they're all in very early stages. There are some companies, private companies, that are starting to look into them, but there's nothing that we know of. There's nothing we have ready to switch on at the moment that would really effectively draw CO2 out of the atmosphere. That said, the recent report by the IPCC, which is the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, they release large-scale assessments created by global researchers, and they're really kind of the definitive go-to authority on the state of climate change. So in a report that they released last fall, they noted that in order to keep us below a warming of 2 degrees centigrade above pre-industrial levels, it's likely that we will need some sort of strategies that are sucking carbon dioxide out of the atmosphere. So because of that, it is important that we start to think about those strategies and to do research on them and to think about the governance structures that we'll need to ensure that there's no one entity, no one country that kind of has their finger on the thermometer and is, affecting the atmosphere for all of us. In terms of what we can do to limit global warming and sea level rise, I would say first and foremost, reducing our greenhouse gas emissions. So both here at the local level, at the level of your home, but also holding our elected leaders accountable for that. That's something that we need to see not just at the personal level or the city level or the state level or the national level. We need to see it in the international level. Because the more we can limit the warming we experience and the sea level rise we experience, the easier it will be to adapt to. I would also say, though, one of the speakers mentioned that we are committed to a certain amount of sea level rise. So even as we advocate for decreases in greenhouse gas emissions, we do need to be planning. We need to be thinking about how we're going to adapt to the sea level rise that's already baked in.
Arthur's going to weigh in.
I think I mentioned this earlier, but one of the nicest ways of sequestering CO2 is through nature. Tidal marshes, submerged aquatic vegetation like eelgrass, which we have just off Alameda. Again, they grow rapidly. They take out carbon from the atmosphere into their structure, and when they decompose, it's kept in the sediment. And so you're taking carbon out. Grasslands, native grasslands, they have this huge root structure, which takes out huge amount of carbon. So there's ways of addressing it that are not as scary as I find some of these they're proposing to put stuff out in the atmosphere to reflect the sun. Well, when we had volcanoes 100 years ago, Krakatoa, etc., you'd had 3 years of poor crops because there wasn't enough sunshine. So I find some of these technical things can be pretty scary. Yes. And there are some natural solutions, and if we just filled the bay with tidal marsh, for example, we would be doing a whole lot towards reducing the CO2 in the atmosphere.
Yeah, our organization as well, looking at a variety of different techniques to sequester carbon. It's restoring our tidal wetlands is, square inch for square inch, one of the most effective things you could do. And it's something I think we could all get behind. It's often called blue carbon if people are interested in learning more about that.
And last but not least, who's the insurance expert on this panel?
What's the question?
The question is, I understand insurance companies are already stopping coverage for homeowners insurance. Is that true? If so, what can homeowners do? Stay tuned for more. All right. Well, I want everybody to give a big hand to our panel. Thank you so much for coming out tonight. For information on future forums, you can join the League of Women Voters of Alameda. You can sign up for our e-blast, or you can check out the calendar on our website, lwvalameda.org.
Doris has Warriors scores.
Oh, and there's Warrior scores.
No. The game is not over.
No, we don't want to know any scores.
Okay.
Doris.
Well, thank you for coming and good night.